In the year 1500, the continent of Europe was poised to leave the Middle Ages behind and enter a brave new chapter of history. The decades that followed can now be seen as the birth of our own modern age. It was a time of discovery, both geographically and intellectually. In art, the spirit of the Renaissance flourished, especially in the great cities of Italy. It was a time when reason and science began to take over from superstition and myth, and Europe would never be the same again. As the 16th century began, the old way of life still persisted, both here in Italy and across the Alps in northern Europe. In the Netherlands, as elsewhere, the medieval spirit still determined much of everyday life, and it was this that inspired one of the most remarkable artists of all time. A man who recognized the follies of man and sought to warn against them in often horrific terms. A man whose own Christianity was mixed with folklore of the time and expressed through his own artistic genius. This was the first of the Dutch masters, Hieronymus Bosch. Details of Bosch's life are extremely scarce. Virtually nothing about him is known for sure. We know that by the year 1431, a man named Jeroen van Aeken became established as a painter here in the city of s-Hertogenbosch, near Antwerp, and 4 of his 5 sons also became successful artists. Jeroen van Aken's grandson, Jeroen, became the best-known member of the family. And today we know him by the pseudonym he adopted, a name derived from that of his home city, Hieronymus Bosch.
He's one of those many Netherlandish painters whose birth date we don't know, and we feel rather uneasy about attempting any kind of dating of the early work. We assume that he was born in 1425 or 1430, somewhere in that bracket, because a document establishing him as an artist does so at a sort of time when most are joining the Guild of St. Luke. And there's a wedding contract and a dispute with a relative by marriage and so on. These odd little things survive. And we know that he died in 1516. And that's about it. And into that, we have to fit an extraordinary body of work. Nobody has ever known how to do it, and everybody sets out to do it with absolute authority. You compare one authority with another, and nothing fits.
What we know about him is small fragments, for example, which Carl van Mander mentions in his life of him. It's a very, very short little life. I mean, it's basically 2 pages, and it tells us a few things about his technique. It tells us a few things about some works he has done, but you know, these works haven't survived. We do not know is it even by him, because you know, Carl van Mander wrote his text something like a bit less than 100 years after Bosch himself had died.
By the mid-1470s, Hieronymus Bosch was active as an artist, and his earliest surviving works reveal artistic concerns that would also feature in his greatest work. Like many painters of the time, the young Bosch turned to the Bible for his subject matter, as we can see with this panel illustrating the wedding feast at Cana, the setting for one of Christ's best-known miracles, the turning of water into wine. Bosch's painting is not an overwhelmingly spiritual image. A strong sense of flawed humanity reveals itself, with symbolism contributing strongly to the effect. Bosch's contemporaries would have immediately recognized the spitting swan as a symbol of sexual promiscuity. And the presence of the magician reminds modern viewers that many medieval folk had faith in more than just the power of Christ. In 15th century Europe, belief in magic was a widespread phenomenon, and Bosch chose to address the subject in paintings such as The Conjurer, also from early in his career. But the conjurer has no real magic powers. Instead, he is a trickster who uses his art as a cunning ploy to distract attention, while his accomplice picks the pocket of the mesmerized man. We can still appreciate the humor of this painting because the foolishness of men did not die out with the Middle Ages. Many of Bosch's studies of human folly express sentiments still relevant today, although the immediate subject matter can often be obscure. Significantly, Bosch chose not to date his works. This means that we cannot be sure when he created images like the Ship of Fools, another highly symbolic scene of human self-indulgence and folly.
I think it's very difficult to actually fix a chronology, and nobody is quite certain. So usually his works are divided into three periods, kind of loose periods, starting in 1474 to about 1485, and then to 1510, and the last one to his death in 1516. Because the thing is, a lot of his paintings have been overpainted, and there's been quite a lot of damage as well. So it's quite difficult even to detect, the technical ways of his painting.
It seems to me that you must do a number of slightly experimental things. You take the early work, or what we presume to be the early work, and compare it with what was happening in the Netherlands, what we know what was happening in the Netherlands in the work of other painters. And you will find that there are parallels, there are ways of constructing figures, there are ways of dealing with perspective, there are ways of distorting pictorial space, which are common.
The efforts of art historians have established how the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch evolved throughout his working life. But some aspects of his art were with him from the beginning. These include the keen humor and strong symbolism that we have already seen. The follies of man would also be a recurring element of his work. As well as folly, Bosch also concerned himself with the darker business of sin and the terrible punishments that lay in store for the sinner. The paintings produced from this preoccupation with sin would revolutionize the world of art forever. Nothing like it had ever been seen before, and no artist has ever matched Bosch's unique vision of hell and damnation. These nightmare visions are, for many, the greatest achievement of Hieronymus Bosch. But with this visual representation of the 7 deadly sins, we see humor prevailing over horror. Created early in his career, the 7 deadly sins was painted in oils on a panel intended for use as a tabletop. Now in Madrid's Prado Museum, the work is dominated by a circle whose center represents the eye of God beholding the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. Below are the Latin words, "Beware, beware, God sees," which is unfortunate for the individuals depicted in the 7 major frames that comprise the outer circle. All of them are engaged in sin, with each frame representing a different transgression in a series of contemporary genre scenes. The message of each frame is clear. Here, anger is represented by an altercation between 2 men whose obvious disagreement may well have been fueled by drink consumed in the background tavern. Similarly, it does not take long to establish that these pleasure-loving individuals are guilty of the sin of gluttony. But this circle of sin strikes the modern viewer as almost quaint in character, amusing rather than threatening. It may be that Bosch intended to evoke such a response from contemporary viewers.
Bosch was a moralist, and he was a moralist in some way obsessed by the devil. The devil for him was everywhere, the sins were everywhere, and this is in fact what he represented in his paintings. I mean, all the forms, the 7 deadly sins, for example, which is a major theme in his work, these were the sins which would take you to hell without a confession. I mean, certainly for him, that was the reality of the things. And he certainly would have believed that people were punished in hell, as he showed it, in fact, in one of his paintings, would be akin to the sins they would have done during life.
Bosch was very much like a medieval preacher, and these medieval preachers would actually tell anecdotal stories, funny stories, to keep the attention of the congregation. And in that way, I think he works just in the same way and tells things in possibly more humorous manner, but it all has a very moral purpose in the end.
It is only outside the center circle that the 7 deadly sins reveals the sense of menace that would characterize much of Bosch's greatest work. In the corners are 4 more circles depicting the so-called 4 last things of man: death, last judgment, heaven, and the ultimate destination of the sinner, hell. Here we see another, later image of the fires of hell, which again provide the background to the sufferings of the damned. Looking at this scene, we can begin to appreciate the kind of hellscape forever associated with Bosch. But we should also recognize that this is just one component of the complete work of art. It forms the right-hand panel of a series of 3 paintings. On the left is a scene of paradise. But the adjoining central panel gives the whole piece its name, The Last Judgment. Bosch's triptychs are undoubtedly his best-known works, and the left-to-right journey from heaven to hell can be seen in many of them. In this series, entitled The Hay Wain, the central panel again presents us with a scene whose subject matter appears innocent enough at first. But this is an image loaded with visual symbols that would have been well understood in Bosch's time. Dutch folklore saw hay both as a symbol of man's pursuit of wealth and of the sinful follies that this pursuit entailed. The owl would also have been recognized as a symbol of heresy, while the vase referred to female promiscuity. But modern audiences can also share the sense of ungodliness that Bosch sought to convey. What is actually pulling the hay wain? And what is the destination of this highly symbolic procession? The right panel of the triptych reveals the terrible truth. We are now in hell itself.
He concentrated on hell because his paintings are warning. They're warning to humanity not to take that way. And this is in fact how his paintings were seen.
Throughout the medieval period, it was impossible for the peasantry and the working classes, slightly different, and the middle classes to exist without having a constant awareness of the imminence of death. It was common for people to get married at the age of 14, have children at once, and be dead by the time they were 24. A short life, not a very merry one. With death, there is judgment, there is hell, there's purgatory, and there is heaven with a stroke of luck. And so it was a world of angels and devils all the time.
Grotesque creatures are one of the most striking features of Bosch's work. as we can see in the terrifying central panel of the Last Judgment triptych. Bosch surely appreciated that it is the unknown that we fear most, and no one on earth could ever have witnessed creatures like these terrible hybrids of man and beast. This is a world with its own internal order of things, an order we cannot fathom other than with reference to the obvious human suffering. It is this totality of vision that makes the Last Judgment a disturbing image even for those who consider the idea of hell absurd. It is unsurprising that many modern critics believe that Bosch must have been inspired by some kind of hallucinogenic stimulant.
Well, I think actually it wasn't necessary for Bosch because, again, there were so many of these fantastic monsters and devils around in the medieval world, all through the medieval world. And so he got inspiration from the margins of manuscripts, from, all around the churches, from the sculptures, and also carvings on misericords, and even the literature. There was a lot of mystic literature which was full of monstrous creations and symbols as well.
People have looked at Bosch in different ways. I mean, some people have, claimed he used hallucinogenic drugs. Some other people said that his work have a kind of alchemical meaning, an astrological meaning, and so on. There may be allusions, obviously, to astrology in his work, so there may be a figure which is akin to an astrological tradition, but that's not what his work is about. His work is first religious, secondly moral, and then, obviously, what makes it so great is the artist's invention, when, possibly because he didn't have so many formulas to follow, he had to invent them. He had to be creative, and this makes him one of the most interesting artists of his time.
We may never know for sure whether Bosch's artistic vision was stimulated by an altered state of consciousness, but we can be certain that the actual execution of his work was as painstaking as that of any other great painter of history. His surviving drawings prove that there was nothing slack or random about the detail of his paintings. This weird figure is known as the Tree Man, an incomprehensible being whose completed form we can see in the most famous of all Bosch's works. This is another image of hell, which forms the right panel of another remarkable triptych, the Garden of Earthly Delights. It is likely that Bosch was in his early 50s when he painted this extraordinary work of art, which remains a defining image of the late Middle Ages. The central panel may be best known today, but the adjoining scenes of paradise and hell are scarcely less impressive. Again, the three panels take us on a left-to-right journey from the paradise of the creation to the fires of damnation, via an outdoor scene of feverish activity, the Garden of Earthly Delights itself. As with many of Bosch's works, this is an image heavy with symbolism. Again, much of the hidden meaning may be lost on the modern viewer, but it is not difficult to realize that the artist is dealing once again with the business of sin, specifically the sin of lust. Birds, fruit, and other devices have been identified as symbols of physical sexuality. The whole idea of a garden of love was derived from a well-established folk tradition, and this is a painting for which a knowledge of contemporary folklore adds immeasurably to our appreciation of the work. Although the Garden of Delights is heavy with symbolic meaning that may be obscure today, the ultimately bleak message of the triptych can be readily understood. The sinfulness of the central panel leads directly to the hell of the panel on the right. Here, once more, it is the sheer imaginative power of the artist that makes the horror effective. When the eye travels over the 2 square meters of this one painting, it is a journey that requires many pauses to take in the scope of Bosch's imagination. the hideous ears with their terrifying blade, the harp transformed into a terrible instrument of torture, the lantern that has become a furnace, horrifying details that are themselves detailed. Again, Bosch may have had symbolic meanings in mind, but even if he did, it is not essential for us to be aware of them. Instead, we can see these features as components of a contingent, imaginary world, whose diabolic menace derives from its unfathomable nature. Quite literally, the devil is in the detail.
To my mind, the world of the Garden of Delights is one of the medieval preacher and the misogynist, and really all the sins have taken on human form in that altarpiece, and they show a kind of chaotic world.
The physical world is very different from the Garden of Early Delights. But remember, Bosch in his Netherlands hadn't seen the mountains, so he showed them as very rocky formations and so on, of strange colors. Bosch composed his world. He composed a world of fantasies. I mean, the world of things which are often, of composite things, quite often as well. This, for example, obviously is the best example being the devils. But also you can see his world as a kind of paradisiac world in which you have all kind of strange, different things, because, you know, paradise is different.
Many of Bosch's religious paintings dealt with the subject of saints in the wilderness, exposed to the temptations of the devil. Few artists can ever have been better qualified for the task. Images such as these gave Bosch the opportunity to demonstrate his skills as a landscapist and his mastery of narrative. Much of this symbolism deployed may now be arcane, and there is no doubt that the lives of the saints were better known in the 16th century than they are today. But we can still appreciate the idea of the isolated Christian, adrift in a perplexing world with only faith to sustain him. One such individual was Saint Anthony, an early believer who passed most of his days in the deserts of Egypt, living as a hermit. According to his hagiography, Anthony's privations included being beaten unconscious by devils in the tomb he used as a prayer house. He was also tempted by the devil in the form of a great queen whose apparent benevolence and goodness was eventually revealed as the deceit of Satan. Both these narrative details can be seen in Bosch's triptych entitled The Temptation of Saint Anthony. But this late work gives the viewer more than just the narrative. The theme of temptation by the devil allowed the artist to give full expression to the fantastic, notably in the middle panel where we see the saint beside the tomb, surrounded by monstrous figures as the fires of hell rage once more in the background. In artistic terms, The Temptation of Saint Anthony is a mature work by an artist who has now reached the peak of his powers. One of the most remarkable details in any paintings by Bosch can be seen within the tomb behind Saint Anthony. There can be no doubting this eternal image. It is Christ himself on the cross. The figure is so small that first-time viewers of the work can fail to notice it. But once we become aware of its presence, it comes to inform the entire work with the Christian message of salvation. Christ would be the subject matter for most of the paintings that survive from the final years of Bosch's life. The finest of these can be considered the artist's final masterpiece, Christ carrying the cross. This is the moment when Christ is most isolated, surrounded by folly, with only a terrible death to come.
Bosch painted the Passion, but the Passion is the main subject of Christian imagery, so there's nothing really surprising in it. I mean, there are scenes which were chosen and codified. There were devotions which were linked to the sufferings of Christ. No, again, his interest in the Passion is a very traditional one.
I think because with the Passion, you could show Christ suffering at the hands of these human sinners to a much greater extent. And it's very much in line with a movement which was very popular in the 15th century called the modern devotion. And that movement taught meditation on the suffering of Christ, contemplation and also imitation. And so the sacrifice of Christ, by meditating on it and concentrating on it, would show up what Christ actually did for the redemption of humankind.
It is Christ himself that represents Bosch's greatest achievement here. Eyes closed, he is somehow apart from the chaos around him. For Christians, this is entirely appropriate. The person of Jesus has human and divine elements, and Bosch somehow captures both in his representation of the Christ figure. Christians also believe that Jesus triumphed over the folly of men with the achievement of his resurrection. But this is an image whose overall sense of pessimism cannot be denied. It is unfortunate that we have no record of the thoughts and beliefs of the artist who created it.
With Bosch, in order to paint what he did and not cause outrage, he must have been extremely devout in his observances. He must have been a religious and not a bitter and twisted old man whom everybody disliked. He must have been deeply respected, which suggests to me that he was serious in all his endeavors, and that his personality, whatever it was, is not allowed to come through.
Hieronymus Bosch, the man, will probably remain a mystery forever, but his work is amongst the most recognizable of all Western art. By the time of his death in August 1516, his achievements were undeniable, and the following decades saw his work become the best known of any artist of the Netherlands. Centuries later, his work proved inspirational to the Surrealists, and much of his work remains as relevant today as it has ever been. But in artistic terms, the work of Hieronymus Bosch would most strongly influence the work of a painter born in the decade after his death, Peter Bruegel the Elder, the second of the Dutch masters. It was a time when reason and science began to take over from superstition and myth, and Europe would never be the same again. As the 16th century began, the old way of life still persisted, both here in Italy and across the Alps in northern Europe. In the Netherlands, as elsewhere, the medieval spirit still determined much of everyday life. And it was this that inspired one of the most remarkable artists of all time. In the year 1500, the continent of Europe was poised to leave the Middle Ages behind and enter a brave new chapter of history. The decades that followed can now be seen as the birth of our own modern age. It was a time of discovery, both geographically and intellectually. In art, the spirit of the Renaissance flourished, especially in the great cities of Italy. A man who recognized the follies of man and sought to warn against them in often horrific terms. A man whose own Christianity was mixed with folklore of the time and expressed through his own artistic genius. This was the first of the Dutch masters, Hieronymus Bosch. Details of Bosch's life are extremely scarce. Virtually nothing about him is known for sure. We know that by the year 1431, a man named Jeroen van Aeken became established as a painter here in the city of s-Hertogenbosch, near Antwerp, and 4 of his 5 sons also became successful artists. Jeroen van Aken's grandson, Jeroen, became the best-known member of the family. And today we know him by the pseudonym he adopted, a name derived from that of his home city, Hieronymus Bosch.